Welcome, everyone, to my podcast series, The Holistic Nature of Us. I invite you to take a journey with me into a better understanding of the concepts behind our holistic nature and how that ties us directly to the natural world around us. My intention is to be your guide for this half hour as we begin seeing our world with fresh eyes, gaining more understanding and learning how we can connect the dots in practical ways that we are nature and nature's in us. I feature a broad range of guests deeply concerned about the environmental issues of our time and more. Authors and educators, practitioners and others whose passion for this earth and for all species help us create sustainable bridges of understanding. These folks are innovators. They're action-oriented, creating solutions in a variety of ways that honor us and the planet's holistic nature. I am so honored to share their stories, their projects, and their passion with all of you. So today, I thank you for joining me for another engaging interview. I'd like to introduce you to the Reverend Brother Mark Gregory D'Alessio, who is a Franciscan friar in the New Religious Society of the Companions of Francis and Clare. He's also an interspiritual Christian priest, a spiritual director, chaplain, retreat leader, author, and past president and executive director of the Psychotherapy and Spirituality Institute, which draws together the inspiration of the Church with the wisdom of psychological care. Currently, Brother Mark lives on Long Island, and he serves as a crisis counselor and program coordinator at a shelter for men and women who are homeless, and as a chaplain at a residential treatment center and school for children with learning and emotional disabilities. In Long Island, he founded the Franciscan Circle, a progressive interfaith gathering of clergy and laypeople who seek to journey in mind and heart with the wisdom and witness of the saints of Assisi, both Francis and Clare. The Circle is dedicated to developing leaders for thoughtful social action and spiritual care. The Long Island Coalition for the Homeless awarded Brother Mark with their Unsung Hero Award last year. So, Brother Mark, it's an honor to have you here today, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. What a joy in the midst of this anxiety and chaos to be talking about such rich and meaningful and faithful things. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. So tell us about your journey. You do so much through your ministry, but how did you get there, and what calls you with this work?
Well, I always return to a spiritual hero at such times, and not only St. Francis, who is so meaningful. We'll talk a lot about St. Francis and St. Clare today. But I'm going to go to Henry Nouwen for a moment. And Henry Nouwen has, among many wonderful works, a book called The Wounded Healer. And that talks about how our gifts emerge out of our wounds if we invite Spirit in to do healing and to move through. Meaning that I have struggled with particular wounds in my life, and I was raised in a very difficult family. I'm a member of Al-Anon because of my stepfather's alcoholism and the kinds of things that went on in our home when we're growing up. And with lots of self-care and work, including opening my heart to faith and realizing that God loved me, even perhaps when I didn't love myself, I was able to move in and through those wounds and realize that because things went not so well growing up, I wanted to hold space for others for compassion. Because things not wonderful happened, I wanted people to understand what wonder could be. Holding a space for others is really at the heart of what I do. So early childhood was seminal for that. And then, of course, there was trying out the ways of the world, meaning that, I bought into the whole system. At one time, for those who are aware of my journey, they understand that I'm now a Franciscan friar and working for a nonprofit and taking a vow of voluntary poverty. In the past, though, I mean, not only you mentioned some of the things in the bio, but I was a business person. I mean, for about almost 18 years, I had my own business where I owned apartments and offices in New York and Paris. I was the highest level on 3 airlines, and the kind of lifestyle that implies, because I was always everywhere but never inside my own inner life. And I started to realize that buying into what the culture said was achievement, was empowering, was whole-making, actually, I felt empty eventually. And I started to realize that the things I did as a volunteer were feeding me more. And I started to pull back from the business commercial side of things and understanding that the gifts I was graced with could actually be put to use in other ways, including eventually in ministry. And that's when I said that God loved me even when I didn't realize myself. I didn't realize that the kinds of things I did were welcome in the church. And then one last aspect about my biography. I'm an out queer man, and I've known I was gay since probably, the tween years, 11 or 12, and the church didn't want me. So, of course, I didn't go anywhere near it. So being an outsider and feeling that, I bought into the culture to become as normal, and I put quotes around that word, as possible, and then realized I was hitting a wall and that God called me, as God calls all of us, to be an individual. And I know we're going to talk about the holistic approach, which means not only human persons, but the entire creation, is that we are all individual and we all have our own sort of thumbprint, fingerprint in this. And I had to let go of what I thought was useful for me to allow God's Spirit in to awaken me to what actually was sustainable and reverent and intelligent for my life. But that was not simple to do. I mean, inner work never is. So over the course of about a dozen years, I eventually let go of what no longer was useful for me, let go of the business world, and started saying yes to this call. I entered into a religious community thinking I was first going to become a priest, and as part, I went up to a monastery. It was a Benedictine monastery in the Episcopal tradition. And as wild as it seemed that I had this vocation to become a priest, for which I was already in formal process, I felt at home in this monastery, and I had to ask, is God really calling me to be a monk? And so I let go of the priestly call for the time being and started the formation to become a Benedictine monk, and I did. I entered the monastery and lived an enclosed life and had such a wonderful understanding of what community can be and what a prayer life behind the closed walls of the monastery could be, that it filled me with joy. But once again, I guess I'm an experiential learner, Judith. As incredible and wondrous as that was, I started to understand that this wasn't my final call, meaning that I need to experience that and to learn from that. But I felt called to do ministry outside the walls of the monastery. Mm-hmm. And for those who understand in classical religious language the difference between a monk as a Benedictine is, or a friar, a brother to others on the highway to life, as a Franciscan is, understands that a monk does their work and their ministry behind the monastery walls for the most part, lives an enclosed life, set apart, monos or monk, and a friar, a brother to others, and that's literally what friar means, a brother, and there are sisters, many sisters in fact, God bless, that one does it outside the monastery walls. And that led me to a discovery of St. Francis through some Franciscan friars I met, and the incredible life of a Franciscan, which promises a change of life that accepts everyone as part of a whole. There is a sense of interdependence of all being, including a kinship with nature, not only with other human persons, but nature and all of matter, the cosmos. It goes all the way back to a beautiful poem. In fact, it's one of the first poems in the vernacular Italian language. That's called The Canticle of the Creatures. We probably are more familiar with it by the title Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon.
Yes.
Francis wrote, that talks about our kinship with the sun and the moon, all the way through to our kinship with sister death, and the full cycle of what it is to be conscious of our own being in a universe of wonders. Now, St. Francis wrote that today. I'm sure he would have started the poem with things like dark matter, right? And other still so relevant today as so much of St. Francis is. So I find St. Francis, although he lived in, well, he was born in, the 11th century, died in the 12th century, that his wisdom is of all ages. It came out of the ancients and it goes forth through today. And I look at this wonderful wheel, this medicine wheel with 5 themes that you shared with me about holism and sustainability and reverence and intelligence and intuition. And I'm saying, well, this could have been written as a biography for the wit and wisdom of St. Francis and St. Clare and the entire Franciscan tradition. Yet, Christianity isn't often thought about that way. So that's what I feel like my vocation is nowadays. It's to hold a space for others, a place for healing, but also to understand that Franciscanism is an alternative orthodoxy. It's a kind of belief and practice that isn't what most think about as Christian. Yet at the same time, it goes back to the original Christian inspiration to understand what is the caring for all beings.
Oh, this is so rich. We could take a half an hour on so many things that you touched upon. First of all, I want to say thank you for sharing the bullet points of your journey, if you will, because I know from my own personal experience the inner road is never easy. And it's the road less traveled, right? The longest road is from our head to our heart. And I hear that in your story, and to take a chance on yourself and go from extensively in the outside world to the inside world through a monastery, the monks, etc., takes great inner courage too, or some kind of inner knowing, intuitive knowing that this is what you have to follow. And that kind of courage I admire, because it's never easy, because it goes against the grain, if you will. It can upset our families and friends. We can lose people along the way just because we're following something that speaks to something deeper within us. And I thank you for sharing that. And then one of the reasons to my listeners that I invited Brother Mark here is that St. Francis and St. Clare in the Catholic tradition, are known as the saints of nature. I always think of the statues of St. Francis with the bird in the hand, and his deep love for every being on the planet. And what I like about Brother Mark's inclusion of Clare is that the masculine and feminine gets honored in this understanding. So I appreciate you relating his philosophy to the passion that I have for doing this work of helping us understanding our holistic nature. So could you tell us more about Francis and Clare and maybe a little bit deeper story about their connection to nature?
Well, certainly. First, and this was what they understood as the ancients did before them, as you and I hope many do today, is that we are not apart from nature. We are a part. We don't live on this earth. We are part of this organism called the earth as human persons. And in the midst of this infectious disease right now called COVID-19 and climate change and all sorts of things that a part of the earth is involved in.
It's true, and it's affecting all of us, isn't it? So we can't hide anywhere. We can't cross an ocean and hope to be a part of it, meaning a part, not a part. So we are a part of what's happening on this planet right now, and it's uniting all of us in so many different ways.
No, indeed. And you could think about how an infectious disease isn't similar to what will happen to our entire planet with climate change. And our attitudes and beliefs and practices for this infectious disease, I hope that moving through this, we will have some wisdom to understand how to work and save our planet. Because Francis and Clare understood these, well, I'm going to say they're very deep questions of ultimate concern, and then I'll go into a little bio. Mm-hmm. Who am I? Who or what is the source, which to me is the God of my understanding? What am I doing here on this planet, and how do I and my family and friends and communities lead a meaningful and purposeful life? I mean, and that's all about relationship, a kinship. And Francis, very similar to my story, but on a much larger scale, because Francis inspired the world of his time. Without the internet, without the kind of mass communication that we have today, Francis became a saint within 2 years after he died, which was an incredibly short period of time to go through the process, because he touched so many people, and that network of people that he touched then moved out and touched others. And people knew that this was something authentic and, dare I say, holy or whole-making. And we talk about the difference between genders in some spiritual traditions, that there's a wall between. I mean, when Clare of Assisi heard a call to be part of the Franciscan tradition, Francis invited her in even to be a brother. And then, of course, hit up against the wall of the church, and then together they started what became known as the second order of Franciscanism, the Poor Clares, and came up with a way that women in that time could be part of the Franciscan tradition. And then ultimately, a third order of Franciscanism came up, where people who were married and lived outside the world could do this. And so you had people like you and I, not nobles, not rich, but living a Franciscan lifestyle. So there were well over 10,000 Franciscans at the time of Francis' death, and now it's the largest religious order with well over 2 million in the various mainstream religious traditions, but many others who actually prescribe to what the wisdom of St. Francis is about. And, you know, you immediately went to Francis and nature, and that attracts so many. But a great spiritual hero, contemporary of mine, Richard Rohr, contemporary Franciscan, has a wonderful phrase to go beyond only this, to get underneath it. He calls it beyond the bird bath. So what I'd like to do when I give you a bit of Francis's and Clare's autobiography is go beyond the bird bath, St. Francis, to understand how this is a wisdom of peace that's essential to answer all these ultimate questions of human concern. Who am I? Who is God? Why am I here? And what is my purpose? Francis started out life as a rich person. He was part of the merchant class. I mean, we're very familiar today with what commercial culture is around. Today we talk about consumerism and this and that. This was at the beginning of all those kinds of things, when people who were not born as nobles, which was as a birthright from divinity, were able to make money as part of a merchant class. In fact, the merchant class amassed so much money that they became as powerful, if not more powerful over time than the nobility. So Francis's father was part of the merchant class. And Francis was born into luxury. And he was very charismatic and popular and was known for running around with his friends and carousing around. I mean, when Francis later on in his life said, I have been all things unholy. If God can do this through me, God can do it through anyone. He was speaking an authentic truth, because although we don't have biographies of him from that time, we know from the mayor of Assisi that the kinds of clubs that Francis belonged to, they not only caroused with alcohol, they hurt women, they destroyed property, and they got away with it because of their money, and they just covered it up with that kind of power. Did Francis do that himself? We don't know that for a fact. But it goes without saying that Francis was on this track of buying into what was important to the culture of his time for a person of his class and power. He then started to become a knight, a noble person, to go to war in the Crusades, because that would bring even more power to his family and authority, to actually be knighted. So he went to war with all the fine things that one could go to war with, that his father purchased for him. Well, he was captured. He was a prisoner of war for a year and a half. His father finally had to ransom him to get him freed. And Francis was never the same. He unlikely started giving up on everything that was important to him in the past. Very likely, he had what we know today as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of being imprisoned. Can you imagine from luxury to going to rags, from going from the best foods to eating what's placed in front of you, of having absolute freedom to none at all?
Yeah, it reminds me of the spiritual principle that sometimes we have to be destroyed in order for us to find the light, or that divinity within us. And that's how I see that part of his journey, and it's painful.
As any of us who have been through that, and we all have in our own way, if not on quite the scale of being a prisoner of war, we've all been prisoners of something. There are many 12-step groups, and that's what they're all about, being a prisoner of something, right?
Right, right.
That when Francis started returning to his everyday life, it wasn't the same. He started living in caves and wearing rags, and started doing menial labor and begging for food. He didn't want anything from his family. He eventually gave up his inheritance and heard a call. And this is where some of the myths come in, and we don't know what is authentic in a spiritual life, and we all have different things that we give our heart to. But he heard from the crucifix this phrase, repair my church. Our Jewish brothers and sisters have a phrase, repair the world, right? Well, this is what he heard, repair the body, repair the church. And he started doing what any sensible person would do. He picked up bricks and mortar and started physically repairing a church.
Right, he took it literally.
And eventually he started to understand that it was only the physical church, it was the spirit of the church. And he started attracting others. They started living in a community of kinship. And they went to the religious authorities, who turned down so many others who did the same. Yet there was something about this friar and his ragtag group of penitents that touched the Pope and the others, that they actually authorized them to do something. And it grew. St. Clare was actually a noble woman, the daughter, who of course would be betrothed to some noble man to make even a greater power for her family. But what she did, she actually heard St. Francis preach, and within the year, She had left her family, had her head shaved, and started as the first female in the Franciscan tradition to show that this was a charism, a spirituality that was not just for men, but for women, for all people. And it grew from there. In fact, what's very little known is St. Francis died in 1226, and St. Clare lived for 27 years after him. And it's because of St. Clare the integrity of the Franciscan tradition was maintained when outside forces wanted to change the vow of poverty to mean other things, when they wanted to change what obedience meant, when they wanted to change what loyalty to God meant. Clare kept the integrity going that the men of her time, who became far more famous, like St. Bonaventure, said she was the Franciscan's Franciscan. And in fact, St. Clare wrote the first rule for women in the church that was accepted. I mean, she was very ill at the time when it was accepted, and she died the day after it was actually authorized by the Pope to become the first female rule. God bless her, right, that she held on.
Yes, and again, what I hear in the story, especially for the time that we're in, there is a feeling of powerlessness going on right now, that this is something we cannot control. It truly is in the divine's hands if we have that belief in terms of what's going on here, the deeper message. But what I hear in the powerlessness of our time, and what I hear in St. Francis's story and St. Clare's, is that if we follow that inner calling, we have no idea how we can impact the world. We really don't know that. And here we are, hundreds of years later, when they lived in their time, following their guidance, doing their thing, trying to make the changes for a holistic life, valuing nature again within the culture. Hundreds of years later, it's still relevant. It still has an impact. It's still affecting us if we choose to look at these way showers. I call them way showers. Other people call them mystics. If we look at where they came from and what they lived through, and they did it anyway. And I think that's the message I'd like to share with my listeners is every step we take impacts the whole, and we have no idea what that really is in the bigger picture.
I mean, Francis and Clare understood that their actions were their only true belongings. What they did was more important than what they said. I mean, there's a very famous quotation by Francis. I didn't say quite in this pithy way. Preach the gospel when necessary, use words. He said something a little more elaborate than that, but what he meant was that we have to preach by our actions. We have to share the good news of what it is to be alive and whole through our actions, not our words, because the words are empty without actions.
And I think most of us would agree with that. We've just created such a culture of busyness that it can be difficult to make the space for that, and that takes conscious effort. And it takes disciplined effort to do that, no matter what the day is like. Because at the end of the day, how we grow our inside is what's really going to be the most important when we complete our tasks here on earth.
Amen. I mean, Francis, as powerful as his practice was for him and his brothers of his time, when he died in one of his last writings called the Testament, he said, I have done what is mine to do. May Christ now give you yours, meaning that you're not going to be able to freeze this. Mm-hmm. You have to have a living tradition and talk with each other and pray and practice and understand as a community where this goes. And you will know if the fruits are there and whether or not you're on the right course. Mm-hmm. St. Clare had something also beautiful to say about this, and I'm going to have to read this because I don't know this by heart. We become what we love, she said, and who we love shapes what we become. If we love things, we become a thing. If we love nothing, we become nothing. Imitation is not a literal mimicking of Christ, and we'll talk about Christ in a moment, okay? So this is incurably and wonderfully Christian. Imitation is not a literal mimicking of Christ. Rather, it means becoming the image of the beloved, an image disclosed through transformation. This means we are to become vessels of God's compassionate love for others, meaning we are not just to feel it and think it, but we are to become an actual doer of compassion. We are to involve ourselves in the mystery of God. That mystery, through our own humility, changes us, or in a religious term, we are converted to something open to transformation. And that transformation is into a being of compassion. Mystery of God, conversion, the fruit of which is compassion. That's the heart of the Franciscan journey. And it's really done by living life without grasping. Sine proprio, a Latin term which means without appropriation, meaning we do not hold too tightly onto anything. We detach from things and live it, but at the same time we are able to be aware of what it is doing to us, so that we are able to say, is this whole-making or does it cause death? Is this reverent and loving or irreverent and corrupt? Even if it's something that we've given our heart to in the past, is there something new we can learn about it? That's called poverty. We often think it's only about money, but it's not. It's about holding on to attitudes that are no longer useful, beliefs that are no longer useful. In fact, Francis saw that grasping onto things that are no longer useful, that are causing death, as the root of all cosmic evil. I'm going to use some Christian imagery for a moment. Many are familiar with the image of Mary as the cosmic mother of God. She's holding baby Jesus, or baby Jesus is in her heart, but she's stepping on the snake. Have you ever seen that statue around Roman Catholic Church?
Yes.
It is on the snake.
Mm-hmm.
The very famous, but not as famous, statue of St. Francis. He there is dressed as a friar, and we know that Francis is the closest we've ever had after Jesus to living a beatitude life. We know he represents that. And what he's stepping on is not the snake. He's stepping on a money bag. And it's not only about money, it's about possessions. Mm-hmm. We hold on too tightly. If we possess things, if we try to control them, then we are not in that flow of love that goes back and forth between the mystery of God and ourselves, the mystery of creation in ourselves, the mystery of each other and ourselves. We interrupt that flow of love. Mm-hmm. And without that love, life.
Well, what I'm hearing today too, with everything that you're saying, is by the virus causing us to be home, we probably have time to be in the stillness. And I know from the brain research that's out there, there's a book, I forget the author, but it's How God Wires Your Brain. They actually have scientific research to back up how the brain functions, but contemplation takes us into, and meditation into the frontal lobe, where compassion, tolerance, patience, love, kindness are accessed in our brain emotionally. The lower brain has fear, and it was designed for fight or flight, to protect us. But there's actually a neural pathway that goes from the lower brain to the higher brain. But the only way we can keep the flow going is through stillness and contemplation, and prayer helps us get to that upper highway, to that upper road, to the upper lobes of compassion and all those other qualities that speak of love and compassion. So that leads us into talking about prayer, based on everything you shared with Francis's journey, St. Clare, and the holistic model. So I would love you to talk to us a little bit about why prayer is so important right now.
Well, I'm going to get thoroughly Franciscan on you.
That's okay.
Right? That prayer is understood not to change God. I mean, both sides of a war pray to God. Sometimes they believe the same God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Prayer isn't about changing God. Prayer is about changing us.
Beautiful. That's beautifully said.
And by giving ourselves permission to enter into that space, that interior space that actually is a connection to everything that is and beyond, we have a chance to know more with a capital M. And then, if we're truly listening and wise and, dare I say, brave, because courage, which comes from the word heart, courage means to hold our hearts open when they want to close. When we pray and we learn something, we feel something, we understand something that is of ultimate concern. If it's authentic prayer, the Franciscan understanding is we get off of our knees and then we do something about it. And that's what prayer is for. We do something about it. So even in this time, in the midst of the anxiety of physical distancing, we are not to observe social distancing.
Mm-hmm.
We are to have hospitality to our neighbor, which is everyone and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that, are we only in touch with our family? Do we learn of someone who actually doesn't have contact? How can we be in contact with them? I mean, this is one of the amazing things for Facebook. People have talked about all the ills of Facebook, yet people are returning to Facebook in an amazing way because it's a way of reaching out, and they're discovering other people and finding hope in these responses, not just the facts about what's going wrong right now and how more people are getting sick and dying. And it's painful to say, I know some friends who have died, some friends who are in ICU, and some friends who are at home right now struggling through this, and I hope that they are part of the 81% of mild symptoms and come through.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
It's powerful. I mean, none of us are unaffected by this, but we're called to get off of our knees and do something about it. This is why you and I are on this podcast right now.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I maintain my practice of spiritual direction and talk to others and listen for God together. This is why I'm still convening a group called the Franciscan Circle, where we used to meet in person, but we're doing it by Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
We can feel encouraged to go out with the people that we can touch, either physically or digitally.
Mm-hmm.
Because physical distancing is not social distancing. And here's a practice for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've been talking about with Facebook and the like, and the prayerful connection with the mystery beyond, the mystery of God. Go outside, bring a little pot or a beautiful dish, put some earth in it. Bring that pot back inside with the earth in it, and when you pray, put your finger in that earth and feel connected. That's from the American Indian tradition, and it's a gorgeous practice. If you have an altar, wherever your place for solitude or contemplation is, bring that pot of earth inside and touch it when you are praying and be part of everything there is.
That's beautiful. I always like to end a podcast with something practical that people can do today. And in my world, I have studied Native American tradition, so we always give thanks, and I either use tobacco or I use cornmeal. And I have sage that I can burn. We don't need to use sage. We can just light a candle if that's all we have. But the point is taking action. And as I shared with you, I'm having this wonderful opportunity of working with teenagers on their dreams, and the same principle holds true. If you get guidance during the night in your deep dreaming time, which I feel we can touch upon the soul level of our being and even the divinity of our being, it's important to bring it into the world, ground it, and take some action on that, however guided. So this is just another way of bringing action into our world through the dream time, through prayers. Get up off your knees and go knock on your neighbor's door. Are they okay? Call somebody that you haven't talked to. Are they okay? We can do all those kinds of things today, and it's bringing us closer. Isn't that interesting? And I just read a beautiful poem today from somebody from Ireland, and part of the lines of the poem are, in Wujan, they can now hear the birds sing, and the clouds have dissipated, and they can see the sky.
Here's something I've heard in my heart, and I don't know if this is of God or just my own fear, but it makes sense when I share it to people of wisdom. Human persons are destroying the planet. Mm-hmm. If you look at a timeline when creation happened 14 billion years ago, through when the earth was formed, through when human beings came on the planet, to the last few centuries, the amount of destruction of the planet and the change is unparalleled since the destruction of the dinosaurs. And there is a powerful system that's holistic at work in the planet. Just like our bodies have immune systems, the earth has an immune system. Are these kinds of things, Earth's own immune system, attacking the infectious disease called human persons? We're destroying the planet.
Well, that's a worthy thought, something to sit with. Taking responsibility for what we have done to this place. It brings us back into what does it mean to be holistic here? How can we take care of this place now? Not tomorrow, not next week, not when the kids go back to school, but what one thing can we do today that will contribute to a holistic, not only a practice, but a way of being, because you keep mentioning being.
The Earth, planet Earth, is not like our automobile, a vehicle for us to travel between places for life. Planet Earth is part of us. We are part of the organism of the Earth. Mm-hmm. We are part of the kinship. And if this time does anything, I hope we're reflecting on how we treat each other and our planet home. Mm-hmm. Walter Brueggemann, an incredible theologian, says something apt about this. He says, what God does first and best most is to trust God's people with their moment in history. God trusts them to do what must be done for the sake of community. Mm-hmm. And that's not unlike what Francis said. I've done what is mine to do. May Christ now give you yours. God trusts us to do what must be done for the sake of the community, and that community includes our kinship with the planet. So I hope as we move in and through this, that we understand that the things that we find life-giving right now have always been life-giving. We just haven't emphasized them. That these are the things that need to be emphasized more, rather than they are not to the background, right?
Right.
They are to be essential, understood as essential. Right now we're doing what's essential. Let us not forget what is essential. And that really is at the heart of what St. Francis was saying with his vow of sine proprio, to live life without grasping, that vow that we understand more popularly as poverty, voluntary poverty. Don't get attached to anything so much. Love it. But don't get so attached that you lose track of the real reality behind it, because you may understand over time that something isn't working and you need to let go of what's no longer useful. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of what's going on up until now is no longer useful. It's no longer essential. What we're understanding in the midst of this terror, in and through our grief, is what is essential, that's life-giving. Let us practice that going forward once we move in and through this terrible time. And let us always remember that our kinship is not just with each other with that, but it's also about our planet home.
Hmm. Oh, Brother Mark, this was such a rich discussion. I can't thank you enough for sharing not only the wisdom that you've gathered in, but making some of the principles clear. I think you have a very clear way of describing a holistic lifestyle, how we can take practical action, the value of prayer and meditation, contemplation in our daily life. And guess what? This virus is giving us an opportunity to perhaps do just that. So, is there anything else before we leave that you'd like to add?
Well, I'd like to express gratitude to you and your big heart and wanting to share perennial wisdom, meaning that I'm sharing this not only about St. Francis, but St. Francis is part of generations of people who came before, and now the tradition is generations that have come after. And just as St. Francis reached beyond the Christian tradition, there's a very famous story about the Sultan of Egypt, and that will be perhaps for another podcast with you, I hope. He also reached out to those most vulnerable, and that's the famous story of St. Francis and the leper, which will be another podcast perhaps. Mm-hmm. What most essential is understand that St. Francis had to face his own shadow. Mm-hmm. He had to face the dark side of what it was to be human. And that dark side had many gifts, and we started that way to talk about the gifts that come out of our wounds. Mm-hmm. So we must always be aware of our hurt. We must not run from it. We must say, hello, my hurt, my dear habits that come out of that hurt. I know you're there, and I will take care of you. Mm. And we all take care.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Robert Ohoto is one of my favorite teachers, and he said this time is forcing us to look at our shadow, looking at all those places that we have not wanted to look at before because we fooled ourselves into thinking we don't have to. And now is a time when we have an opportunity to do that. And so many teachers like yourself, like Robert Ohoto, and others that I deeply admire are deeply passionate about helping us wake up to this part of what's going on right now. You know, not to be afraid of it. We can help each other through the dark time. And we can come out of the other side more enlightened and more compassionate and more caring and maybe happier, happier that we've let go of some of the attachments to stuff that really no longer serves us.
Indeed. I mean, this sounds Buddhist, but it's also the perennial tradition, all the spiritual traditions, that says that love and life are also about suffering. Yet if we accept that there's suffering, and there is, we understand also that the conditions for happiness, for wholeness, are also still there. Mm. So suffering is the consequence of loving. We will always suffer and struggle. We will fall and get back up. We will fall and get back up. We will fall and get back up. And the conditions for full, whole life are still there if we want to say yes to them. So, if anything, podcasts like this, Our Faith, they inspire us to get back up, because those shadows aren't only what we consider dark, the things we get attached to. Only with enlightenment or wisdom do we understand that they're dark. They seem golden at the time. Money, wealth, power, position, those are golden shadows. Mm-hmm. Our ego gets attached. So we have to let go of that egoic operating system and bring other systems online, the systems of the heart, the systems of the wisdom of the mind, the systems of the body that knows that we are all one. Those three intelligences, and they connect to everything in the wider universe.
They do. Well, thank you. I think I'd like to end here. I think you've given us a lot to think about. Would you like to share with us your contact information?
Well, certainly, and I'm sure it will be as part. I understand my short bio will be part of this podcast when you click on it. So you include my email address there. It's br as in brother, br.markgregory, and that's Mark with a K, br.markgregory@icloud.com. So I hope you'll be in touch. I hope something here was useful, and please share your wisdom. Humility is a sense of awe in a universe of wonders. Everyone who listens to this, you are part of the wonder of the universe, and please let yourself be known.
Thank you. What a beautiful way to end. Well, folks, another deeply thought-provoking interview, and I hope you are inspired by it as much as I am. And I want to thank Brother Mark again for his time and sharing with us today. So thank you. This is Judith Dryer. I am the author of Garden's Gate, book and blog. My book is available through my website, which is www.judithdryer.com, as well as several distribution arms such as Amazon, Nook, Goodreads, and more. I'd like to remind all of you again that a transcript is available for each podcast. Please like and share them. Let's support each other and get the word out. And remember, now is the time for practical action and profound inner change, so we value our world again. Enjoy your day.